Now we're doing IT Essentials Module 6. Everything have 3 digits. This one, I just could not allow it to have 3 digits. If you know, you know. But you know why. Anyway, moving on. What is a MAC address analogs? What does MAC and address analogs do? Analogs to. Hey, this does not make sense. A fingerprint that uniquely identifies a device. I think the sentence should be, what does a MAC address analogs do? And then it says, a fingerprint that uniquely identifies a device. What happens to a device's MAC address when it moves to a different network? What happens to a device's MAC address when it moves to a different network? It remains the same. Yeah, it stays the same. Nothing changes. It's just a different network, not a different address, not a different device. Different devices, different addresses. What or which of these is a valid representation of a MAC address? What is a MAC address, or which one looks like a MAC address? Okay, 00, 50, 56, BE, 7, D7, 87. That's the structure of a MAC address. Just know your structures of MAC addresses, okay? What is an IP address analogs do? What do MAC address analogs? What do IP address analogs do? What do those do? This would be a mailing address. This would be a mailing address that specifies a device's location. This would be a mailing address that specifies a device's location, okay? What typically happens to a device's IP address when it moves to a different network? Nothing happens. No, wait, what? What typically happens to a device's IP address when it moves to a different network? It changes to reflect the new network location. It changes to reflect the new network location. Oh, so IP addresses change, but MAC addresses stay the same. Okay, cool. Which of these is a 32-bit address? What does a 32-bit address look like represented in a dotted decimal format? What does a 32-bit address look like when it's represented in a dotted decimal format? It looks like this: 3 digits, dot, 3 digits, dot, 3 digits, dot, 1 digit. Got it? Good. What type of address is automatically assigned by the Windows when it cannot contact the DHCP server? What type of address is automatically assigned by the Windows when it cannot contact the DHCP server? What does DHCP stand for? Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol. That's what DHCP stands for. Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol. What type of address is automatically assigned by the Windows when it cannot contact a Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol server? That would be the IPA address. What does IPA address stand for? IPA, APIA. API-PA address. It stands for automatic private IP addressing. Automatic private IP addressing. That's what it stands for. And the address which is 3 digits, dot 3 digits, dot 1 digit, dot 1 digit range. That would be the automatic private IP addressing. Which of these is a 182-bit addressing represented in the hexadecimal format? What does a hexadecimal format look like in an IP address that is represented in a... What does a 128-bit address look like? 128-bit address. What does it look like when it's represented in the hexadecimal format? This is what it looks like. Okay. That means there's no zeros here, okay? Cool. What type of address is required by every IPv6 enabled device on the network, on a network? What type of address is required by every IPv6 enabled device on the network? That would be the link local address. The link local address. That would be the address that is required in the IPv6 enabled device. Which service automatically assign an IP address information to network devices? Which service automatically assigns an IP addressing information to a network device? That would be the DHCP. What does DHCP stand for? Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol. Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol. What does a subnet mask identify in an IP configuration? What does a subnet mask identify in an IP configuration? Okay, the network on which the computer is connected. This would be the network on a computer. This would be the network on which the computer is connected. This would be the network on which the computer is connected. What does a subnet mask look like in an IP configuration or identify? I think it's supposed to say, how do you identify a subnet mask in IP configuration? And then you say it would be the network on the computer that is connected. It would be the network on which the computer is connected. What identifies the router that a device will use to access the internet? What identifies the router that a device will use to access the internet? A default gateway. A default gateway. Which method requires manually configuring IP addresses in IP addressing information on each device? Which method requires manually configuring IP addressing information on each device? That would be static addressing. Static addressing would be the method that requires manually configuring IP addressing information on each device. What is the first step in the DHCP process when a client wants to join a network? What would be the first step in this DHCP? What does DHCP stand for again? That would mean the Dynamic Host Configuration Processing Protocol. Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol. What is the first step in the dynamic host configuration protocol process when a client wants to join a network? That would be a client broadcasts a DHCP discover message. The client should broadcast a DHCP discover message. Which DNS record type is used to resolve a domain name to an IP4 address? What does DNS stand for first? DNS stands for Domain Name System. And which domain name system record type is used to resolve a domain name to an IP4 address? That would be a record. It's called a record, okay? What is the primary purpose of a VLAN? What is the primary purpose of a VLANs in a switched network? The purpose would be to provide segmentation and organizational flexibility. The purpose would be to provide segmentation and organizational flexibility. Which protocol is used by the ping command to test network connectivity? Which protocol is used by the ping command to test the network connectivity. That would be the ICMP. ICMP stands for? It stands for Internet Control Message Protocol. Internet Control Message Protocol. What is the first security priority? What is the first security priority when setting up a new wireless router? It would be to change the default administrative password. That would be to change the default administrative password. What is the purpose of a MAC address filtering on a wireless network? What is the purpose of a MAC address filtering on a wireless network? To allow or deny network access based on device hardware addresses. What is the purpose of MAC address filtering on wireless network? To allow or deny network access based on device hardware addresses. What technology allows multiple devices to, like a thermostat and a security camera I almost said camera to connect to a network? Which technology allows multiple devices like a thermostat and a security cameras to connect to a network? That would be the Internet of Things. IoT, Internet of Things. What is the primary reason for the development of an IPv6? IPv6, Internet Protocol version 6. To overcome the address space limitations of IPv4. To overcome the address space limitations of IPv4. What is the first rule of reducing the notation of IPv6 address? What is the first rule for reducing the notation of an IPv6 address? Omit any leading zeros in 16-bit section. You just remove. Omit means just remove the leading zeros. You just remove the zeros in any 16-bit section, okay? What is the second rule for reducing IPv6 address notation, and what is its restrictions? What is the second rule for reducing the IPv6 address notation, and what are the restrictions? That would be a double colon can be replaced any group. A double colon can replace any group of consecutive zeros, but can only be used once. A double colon can replace any group of consecutive zeros, but can only be used once. Which DNS, what does DNS stand for? Domain Name System. Domain name system. Which domain name system record type is used to resolve a domain name to the IPv6 address? This sounds familiar, doesn't it? Okay. Which DNS record type is used to resolve a domain name to the IPv6? It would be the FOPL A. FOPL A, guys. Quadruple A. It is the AAAA record. That means it surpasses the level of a AAA record, okay? Which DNS, what does DNS stand for? Domain Name System. Which domain name system record identifies email exchange servers for the domain? That would be the MX record. What does MX record stand for? That is the mail exchanger record, okay? The mail exchanger record. Okay, what or which of the domain name system TXT record feature identifies authorized SMTPs servers? Okay, what does DNS stand for? Domain naming system, domain name system. And then what does TXT stand for? And then what does the SMTP stand for? Let's figure out the acronyms and then we can continue with the sentence because acronyms are very important. Okay, so let's read the sentence without the acronyms. Which domain name system text record features identifies the authorized simple mail transfer protocol, authorized simple mail transfer protocol servers to help combat the spam? That would be the SPF, which is the Sender Policy Framework. The Sender Policy Framework. How does DKIM provide more advanced spam protection than the SPF? How does the domain keys identified mail provide more advanced spam protection than the Sender Policy Framework? Yeah, so how does a domain keys identified mail provide more advanced spam protection than the Sender Policy Framework? It uses the cryptographic authentication with digital signatures. It uses cryptographic authentication with digital signatures, okay? On which UDP port do the DHCP servers listen for the client messages? On which UDP port do the DHCP servers listen for the client messages? On which user datagram protocol port does the dynamic host configuration protocol servers listen for the client messages? On the user datagram port 6, user datagram protocol port 67, user datagram protocol port 67. Oh, it's a tongue twister, guys. On which UDP port do the DHCP clients listen for the server messages? Wait, we've done this before, haven't we? No, we haven't. It's a different question. Okay, let's read it without the acronyms. On which user datagram protocol port does the dynamic host configuration protocol clients listen for the server messages? That would be the user datagram protocol port 68. What does a client do after receiving the DHCP message to ensure the IP address is unique? Okay, guys, so it turns out it's not only the DHCP, but there's also the DHC request. There's the pre-request, and there's also the DHC pre-offer and the DHCP discover. And when we look at ours, that would be the server to the client. The server acknowledges the request and finalizes the IP address, lease, and configuration for the client. What the DHCP message essentially confirms the assign and completes the setup for the client to start using the network. Okay, so what does the client do after receiving a DHCP message to ensure that the IP address is unique? What they do is they send a ARP request. ARP stands for Address Resolution Protocol. It sends an address resolution protocol request for the provided IP address, okay? Cool. What is the purpose of the DHCP reservation? What does DHCP stand for? Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol Reservation. Reservation, what is that for? Oops. to ensure a specific client always receives the same IP address, okay? What is the main difference between an IPv4 and an IPv6 regarding the link local addresses? That would be an IPv6 device must always have one, while an IPv4 device uses it as like a fallback, you know? Yeah. What is the correct order of the four-step DHCP process? What is the correct order for the four-step DHCP process? Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol. The order is you discover, you offer, you request, you acknowledge. It's called the DORA. DORA. Discover, offer, request, acknowledge. DORA. Which wireless router setting is used to prioritize traffic for specific applications like a video streaming or gaming? Which wireless router setting is used to prioritize traffic for specific applications like video streaming and gaming? That would be the quality of service, QoS. What is the best practice when installing a new driver for a NIC? What does NIC stand for? Network Interface Card. That's what NIC stands for. What is the best practice when installing a new driver for the network interface card? It would be to disable the virus protection software and then temporarily to avoid conflicts, okay? What command line utility uses ICMP to test connectivity between computers? ICMP stands for Internet Control Message Protocol. What command line utility uses an Internet Control Message Protocol to test connectivity between the computers? It would be the ping. What is the typical role of a wireless router in a small office or a home office network? It would be, it performs roles of router, a switch, a wireless AP, and often firewall and the DHCP server. What does DHCP stand for? Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol Server. After configuring a new IP address on a wireless router, what must a connected PC do to obtain a new address from the correct range? After configuring a new IP address on a wireless router, what must a connected PC do to obtain the new address from the correct range? It must release and renew its IP address. Which port on the wireless router is typically used to connect to the modem for the internet access? Which port on the wireless router is typically used to connect to the modem for the internet access? It would be the internet or the WAN port, WAN wide area network. What is the bit length of a MAC address? What is the bit length of a MAC address? It would be 48 bits. Which organization is responsible for the development of IPv6? Which organization is responsible for the development of IPv6? It would be the Internet Engineering Task Force. In the ipconfig all command output, what does Windows call this in the IP address? It calls it the physical address, okay? What is the primary function of the subnet mask? It would be to distinguish the network portion from the host portion of the IP address. It would be to distinguish the network portion from the host portion of the IP address. In the example, if a computer has the IP address of this and wants to send data to this, where does it send the data to? It sends it to the default gateway, which is the router. It sends the default gateway to its default gateway, okay? Approximately how many unique addresses does the 128-bit IPv6 address space provide? Approximately how many unique addresses does the 128-bit IPv6 address space provide? It provides 304 antecillion. You decillion, antecillion, baba. 500 trillion. In the IPv6 address representation, how are the letters typically addressed or expressed? In the IPv6 address representation, how are the letters typically expressed? They are all expressed in lowercase, okay? What is the total number of hexadecimal values in a fully expanded IPv6 address? What are the total number of hexadecimal values in the fully expanded IPv6 address? It would be 32. 32 is the total number of hexadecimal values in a fully expanded IPv6 address. Which of the following is the correct application of Rule 1, omit leading zeros, for the IPv6 segment 0, 1, 2, 3? You just remove the 0, right? Yeah, you just remove the 0, and so it's going to be 1, 2, 3. What is the restriction when using the double colon in the IPv6 compression? You can only use it once. And if it has like continuous zeros, or what's that English term again? Okay, it can only be used once within an address. If it has continuous zeros, only zeros. Which of the following is a statistically assigned configuration parameter that identifies the router a device uses to access other networks? That would be the default gateway. What is the major advantage of using dynamic addressing, DHCP? What is the major advantage? To reduce the possibility of assigning duplicate or invalid IP addresses. It reduces the possibility of assigning duplicate or invalid IP addresses. Which type of DNS resource record is used to resolve a domain name in the IPv6 address? Which type of DNS resource record is used to resolve a domain name to an IPv6 address? 4A record, 4A's record. In the MX record, which priority value is preferred when the multiple email servers are available? That would be the lower integer. Which anti-spam DNS feature uses a list of authorized SMTP servers? Which anti-spam DNS feature uses a list of authorized SMTP servers? That would be the SPF, Sender Policy Framework. What is the first message of a DHCP client? What is the first message a DHCP client sends to a DORA process? It just sends the DHCP discover, which is the broadcast, okay? After a client receives a DHCP pack, what does it do to ensure the IP address is not already in use on the network? It sends an ARP request for the provided IP address. It sends an ARP request for the provided IP address. What is the purpose of DHCP reservations? What is the purpose of DHCP reservation? It would be to ensure a specific device by the MAC address always gets the same IP address. What is the default VLAN assigned to all the switch ports? What is the default VLAN assigned to all the switch ports? It would be the VLAN 1. The VLAN 1. What device is required for communication between the devices on different VLANs? What device is required for communication between the devices on different virtual land area network? You will need a router. What is the range of the IPv4 link local IPA address, which is, what does IPA stand for again? It stands for Advanced Private IP Addresses. That would be this. Okay, which of the following is true regarding the IPv6 link local addresses? Which of the following is true? Which of the following? Every IPv6 enabled device is required to have one. Every required device is required to have what? A link local address, okay? What is the best practice when updating your NIC, a NIC driver? You have to disable the virus protection software and close all applications. Which protocol does the ping command use to test network connectivity? It uses the ICMP. What is the first and the most important security step when configuring a new wireless router? You need to change the default administrative passwords, okay? On the wireless router, which port is typically used to connect to the modem for the internet access? You use the internet or the WAN port. What feature on the wireless router allows you to prioritize traffic for applications like the online gaming or streaming? It would be the quality of service. Which type of list specifies which IP addresses are allowed or denied on a network, similar to the MAC address filtering? It would be the access list or the white listing or blacklisting. And we're done.